I changed my major and entered a medical school. At that time, it was Bellevue Hospital Medical School. The time was 1892, and Bellevue Medical School at that time and today is on 26th Street and First Avenue. Now, Bellevue was not a great training ground for scientists, but I was a good student. I was very industrious. I helped my fellow students when I could. I have to admit I was shy. Very often I didn't have enough money for transport from where we lived in New York to the hospital medical school. So I had to walk the 5 miles between home and school. Whenever I had the time, I went across the street to the Carnegie Laboratory, where they were scientists engaged in medical research. This place was filled with what I found fascinating: test tubes, Bunsen burners, microscopes, all of the things that fascinated me. As a result, I became quite a single-minded individual, and as a result of my immersion in medicine and science, I know little of art or literature or music, even today. My heroes were Lister and Koch, Theobald Smith, Pasteur, and I graduated with honors from medical school in 1895, as of course my parents had expected me to, and I interned at Bellevue Hospital, and in return for a 16-hour day, I was given a bed, board, and laundry facilities. And I had the opportunity to study a wide variety of diseases. My reports on the patients, or so I'm told, was brief. They were brief, but they were extremely thorough. And then when I finished my internship and I had to earn a living, the question was, where do I practice medicine? One of my teachers said, the practice of medicine in New York City, too many doctors already, but in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, they need doctors, and so I went to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and set up a practice there. At this time, the first year I earned $600, and the second year in Wilkes-Barre I earned $1,200. Now, quite frankly, I really was not interested in the monetary aspects of medicine, especially in private practice. I was more inclined toward understanding the nature of disease. And so in 1899, I responded to a notice in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the notice said that there were vacancies in the U.S. Public Health Service. I got a job at an annual salary of $1,600 in the U.S. Public Health Service, and my first assignment was at Ellis Island in New York, where ironically, only 18 years previously, my parents and I had come to America. Now, I was a junior medical officer looking for diseases amongst the immigrants. My next assignment was at Reedy Island, which was a quarantine station for ships bound for Philadelphia. And the vessels had to be examined, and the hold of the ship had to be fumigated to eliminate the rats and the mosquitoes, so as to prevent the introduction of disease into the United States. Some of the diseases that we were interested in quarantining or preventing from entering the United States were things like yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, dengue, parasitic worms, typhus, measles, and diphtheria. And in the process of working on these ships, I actually contracted yellow fever and typhus. I, of course, as you can see, recovered from these diseases, but I became, as a result of this experience, an accomplished sanitarian and a microbiologist. Now, some of you are probably scratching your heads and saying, what has all this got to do with pellagra? Well, you'll see shortly, but you have to have what I have, and that is Sitzfleisch. Sitzfleisch in Yiddish or in German means the flesh to sit. You have to have sittability, patience, and perseverance. In my 15th year as a public health medical officer, the year was now 1914, I received a letter from the Surgeon General, and it read, and I quote, "Within the past several weeks, the importance of pellagra has been urged on me by members of Congress and other prominent people from sections in which the disease prevails. It is undoubtedly one of the knottiest and most urgent problems facing the service at the present time. There is every likelihood that those interested will be instrumental in having appropriated approximately $80,000 for carrying out the pellagra investigations during the coming fiscal year. For certain reasons, Dr. X has requested to be relieved from further pellagra work for a time, and I feel that it's best that he should be. I am therefore under the necessity of selecting an officer who will be in charge of these studies and who will take them up from a broad and energetic standpoint. After going over the entire field, I feel that you are preeminently fitted for this work and that it could be placed in no better hands. I would like to have you take charge of it as soon as possible, and I'm writing to you in order that you may know of my plans. It is needless to say that I shall assist you in the way of furnishing assistance." Pretty good. By the time I came on the scene, a staff of very able men in the public health service had devoted 5 years studying pellagra. And the report of the Pellagra Commission, which was carried out between 1912 and 1914, had concluded the following. Pellagra is in all probability a specific infectious disease communicable from person to person by means at present unknown. Despite these conclusions, they found no infectious agent. So, having this assignment, I decided to do what any good clinician would do, examine the patients. And we can examine the patients this way, or we can examine the patients with our eyes and our ears, and we can touch them, and we can examine their bodies. Now, the first thing I did was I traveled mainly through the pellagra belt, which, of course, as you know, was now the southern part of the United States. And at South Carolina Hospital, I discovered a paradox. The nurses, the orderlies, the doctors who treated these patients with pellagra slept in the same rooms, had the same direct contact with them as with one another and with the pellagrans, and yet not a single one of these individuals came down with pellagra. It occurred to me, even after this brief encounter, that pellagra was not a contagious disease spread by direct contact. Indeed, as someone who had recovered from both typhus and yellow fever, I recognized that to become infected, one had to be exposed to the causative agent. And then, of course, one would recover, hopefully, from this. Now, the doctors and the nurses, although they apparently were immune to pellagra, never had experienced even the mildest of skin rashes. So how could they be protected against this disease? I then got on the train again, and in Milledgeville, Georgia, at the Georgia State Sanitarium for the insane, I suggested to the physicians that pellagra occurred only amongst the poorest of the patients, and that the difference between the poor and the not so poor was the food that they were given in this insane asylum. But the physicians at the insane asylum said, this is nonsense. We all have the food prepared in the same kitchen. They eat what we eat. I heard what they said, but it didn't make much sense with me. Now, what were they fed in this kitchen? They were fed a diet of cornmeal mush, hominy grits, and cane syrup. But the physicians had this basic menu supplemented. They had nice cuts of meat, some vegetables, and milk. But the patients had no supplements such as this. Now, this simple explanation, a dietary basis for pellagra, seemed absurd. How could it be so simple and yet have eluded investigators for 200 years? In the summer of 1914, I went to Jackson, Mississippi, where at the Methodist Orphan Asylum, there were 211 children, and 168 of these had pellagra. But all of the pellagra cases occurred in a small subset of these children. Most of the children between the ages of 6 and 12 had pellagra. Those younger than 6 did not, and those older than 12 did not. This is a puzzling distribution. And then what I did was examine the living conditions amongst these children. The little ones, those under 6 years of age, received milk, but the older ones did not. But those over 12, they were rewarded for doing small jobs, and they received a higher ration of meat. And these children, sort of adolescents, were always hungry, and they grabbed food wherever they could. In short, these older children supplemented their basic diet of biscuits and hominy grits and corn mush and molasses and sow belly with fresh animal meat, such as animal components, such as meat and milk and eggs and butter, and the meat was quite lean. So at the end of that summer, I wrote to the Surgeon General of my suspicions. And I wrote this way: while confident of the accuracy of our observations and of the justice of our inferences, there is nevertheless grave doubt in my mind as to their general acceptance without some practical test or demonstration of the correctness of the corollary, namely, that no pellagra develops in those who consume a mixed, well-balanced diet. And I suggested a rather simple experiment. Let's supplement the diets of those who were most likely to get pellagra. At the orphanage, every child under 12 years of age got 14 ounces of milk a day, and those under 6 years of age got 20 ounces. Eggs were added to the daily menu, and fresh meat was now to be served 4 days a week instead of 1. Remarkably, pellagra faded away, and the orphanage had no new cases. It was really too good to be true. In fact, so much so that I decided that the following spring we ought to do a controlled experiment. Now, this controlled experiment, you may not know the difference between an experimental and a control. So let me tell you what the difference is. If you have a control group, the control group, you do nothing. And in the experimental, you change the condition, so you add something. Now, the idea was to see whether diet was in fact involved in this. And so we were going to do an experiment. Now, this experiment, which could not be done today for ethical reasons, was that we use a population that consisted of convicts at the Mississippi Rankin prison farm, especially those serving life terms. The group seemed to be ideal. They were used to being watched. They endured restrictions. Time was of little consequence to them since they were imprisoned for life. And they could be rewarded in a substantial way. That is, we could give them a full pardon. The governor of Mississippi, after much persuasion, eventually approved of the use of a dozen convicts. And after we smoothed out the legal details, the experiment began in April of 1915. at this Rankin prison farm. And it's important to note that at the Rankin prison farm, pellagra had never occurred. Now, here was the experimental group. Here's what we're going to feed this group. We're going to feed them for breakfast: biscuits, fried corn mush, syrup, grits, brown gravy, coffee, sugar. Lunch: cornbread, cabbage, sweet potatoes, grits, and syrup. Dinner: fried corn mush, biscuits, rice, gravy, corn syrup, coffee, and sugar. The men were placed in screened quarters to eliminate any flies and mosquitoes, and they were given some light physical work. The experimental group were 80 convicts, which were kept under similar conditions, except that they had this group supplemented with food from the prison farm. So they had fresh vegetables and other supplements. Now, after the first month, the convicts on the unsupplemented diet, that is the diet that I've just given you, this group, they had headaches, they had dizziness, they had a burning sensation in their mouths, but they didn't have any rash. Indeed, it took 6 months on this diet before the telltale rash of pellagra developed. And it appeared on the neck and on the hands of the convicts. Not all of them, probably about 50% of the convicts showed this disease. And I was really rather overjoyed with this kind of result. But this was really only the beginning. In collaboration with an expert statistician, working also in the Public Health Service, we conducted surveys on the geography, the economics, the diet of people living in the Carolinas and other southern states. And we found this: among the poor, the greatest dependence was on foods that were lower down on the scale. That is, this did not include meat, it did not include fresh vegetables, it did not include eggs. It was this monotonous food of hominy grits, cornmeal mush, and so on. And in 1907, there was a depression in the U.S., and the cost of meat rose 40% over all other foods. This meant that meat was very, very difficult for those poorest, those lowest on the economic ladder, to obtain an adequate diet. So the lower one feeds down on the food chain, the more prevalent was pellagra. And in the southern mill towns, we found it most prevalent. So what we had done with this study of pellagra and its distribution was what John Snow had done 75 years ago with the disease cholera. We found that there was a strong correlation of a disease with a particular population distribution. We were now not only clinicians, we were epidemiologists. Now, you could always say epidemiological evidence, correlations are simply statistics. And of course, you know you can prove almost anything with statistics. And some of our critics, in fact, said exactly that. In fact, that the prevailing view at this time was the contagionist view, the infectionist view, that almost all diseases, including pellagra, was as a result of the acquisition of some foreign material, some bacterium or maybe a virus. And now they made scathing comments on our work, especially these diet experiments. I became sensitive, I became irritable, I became impatient, and I decided to do something quite uncharacteristic for me. I decided I would do a daring experiment, a daring and convincing experiment, which would prove that pellagra was not an infectious disease. So we began what we called filth parties. These filth parties included 20 of my friends and my wife and myself. we became the susceptible animals. We were going to be injected and were injected with the blood of patients that had pellagra. And then we took these gelatin capsules and we scraped the skin from these individuals and took some blood from the pellagrins, people who had pellagra. We dried it, we put them in the capsules, and we swallowed these capsules. If anyone had pellagra and it was an infectious disease, surely these kinds of introductions of eating or blood from a pelegrin should produce pellagra in the volunteers, us, the filth party group. But not one of us became sick. So swallowing urine or feces or skin or being injected with blood from pellagra infected individuals should have given us an infection good and hard, but it didn't. And I wrote in my diary, it's the last time, never again, none of us became ill with pellagra, and it quite clearly shows pellagra is not an infectious disease. So what we had shown was that pellagra was a nutritional disease. And we found that we could prevent this disease by simply adding fresh meat, milk, eggs, and vegetables to the diet. These would contain, at that time we didn't know it, we called it the PP factor, that is the pellagra preventive. So we were on the search for this pellagra preventative factor, and the plague of pellagra was really a plague of one kind of food, and that one kind of food was corn. Corn lacks the PP factor. So eating hominy grits, corn mush, and cornbread, all lacking this factor, would result in pellagra. And once we understood that the key to the pellagra was in the diet, we were on the way to preventing the disease and identifying what this PP factor was. Now, what we needed was an experimental animal. We certainly didn't want to continue to work on humans insofar as this pellagra was concerned, and we developed an animal model. We found if we fed dogs or rats on a diet, which I'll call the 1-2-3 diet, this diet consisted of cornmeal, cowpeas, casein, milk protein, sucrose, cottonseed oil, cod liver oil, sodium chloride, and sodium carbonate. We fed these to dogs or rats. They developed what is called black tongue. It required only 60 days on this 1-2-3 diet to produce the symptoms of pellagra in these dogs and rats. Now, we believe that there was a deficiency of some special combination of either amino acids or some unknown dietary factor that produced a pellagra. And we found that it wasn't the beriberi factor. You call that thiamine today. But the PP factor was heat resistant. That is, you could cook it up. And it was contained in dried brewer's yeast. All you had to do was sprinkle some brewer's yeast on this 1-2-3 diet, and black tongue disappeared almost miraculously. And not only that, if you add it to the diet before the animals became pelegrin, then they never developed pellagra. Now, this was 1920. And in spite of our understanding that pellagra was a dietary deficiency disease, in 1928, there were 120,000 people in the United States suffering from an attack of pellagra. So you might ask the question, why? If we understood the nature of this disease, why didn't we cure pellagra? Why did so many people have to be stricken with this disease? And the answer lies in a simple fact. Pellagra is a problem of poverty. Education of people will help. Improvements in basic economic conditions can be expected to heal some of this festering ulcer of our people. But this can't be accomplished in a day. But that day will be hastened by the cooperative action of all of those who have the vision which enables them to see the great social and economic advantages to be derived from the eradication of this disease. Now, some years later, 1937, a man named Conrad Ilveghem, working at the University of Wisconsin, identified the chemical nature of this PP factor. It was nicotinic acid, or we now know it as the vitamin niacin. And so we come full circle in our understanding of pellagra. Pellagra is not an infectious disease. It's not due to a microbe entering the body. Rather, pellagra is a dietary deficiency disease, and it results from the absence of a single vitamin, niacin. I want to close with a few personal observations. I grew up as a poor boy in New York City, and despite that, succeeded in making an important contribution to the health of the world, and in some measure helped the plight of those at the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. My illiterate parents instilled in me the qualities of perseverance, honesty, sensitivity, and hard work. They sacrificed and they loved me, so that I was always fortunate to know how much they meant for me to succeed in learning. Now, the ability to find the meaningful amongst that which is meaningless requires preparation. It involves perseverance. It involves purpose. It involves patience. And it involves pragmatism. All that was involved in P, pellagra. I want all of you to remember, as I do to this very day, to use good sense, be flexible, and be sensitive to the social context. For pellagra shows most clearly how we can become misled by proposing that all diseases are caused by infectious agents known as microbes. And it also shows that some diseases can be related to economic conditions, and how, once we understand the cause of a disease, that disease might be eliminated. But I want you also to recognize, and I want to urge great caution here, simply identifying the cause of a disease does not mean that that disease will be immediately eliminated. Immediate cures do not usually occur. The cure must be endorsed by the community at large, health workers, as well as those who are susceptible, the general population. And the solutions for cure of some of these diseases must be cost effective, they must be socially acceptable, and a cure for a disease without acceptance by the public may never realize its true potential. So the limits to our ability to cure a disease require 5 important elements. These are what I would consider maybe modifications of Koch's postulates. The first thing that you want to do is you want to identify the disease. The second thing that you want to do is identify the cause. And as we've seen today, the cause of pellagra is a dietary deficiency, a plague of corn in this case. And then you want to develop a means for cure. Now, if this were an infectious disease, a means for cure might be either an antibiotic or a chemotherapeutic or maybe a vaccine. The fourth point is that you want to deploy this cure in a socially acceptable way and to make it available. So it has to be acceptable to the public, and it has to be available. And finally, once this is, then you actually implement this cure. And now, I leave you to ponder the following question. What is a vitamin? Why do we require vitamins? And why does a vitamin deficiency lead to disease? Thank you for your attention. I will return